Welcome to the Canadian Homeschooler podcast, where we have real conversations about all things homeschooling from a Canadian perspective. I'm your host, Lisa Marie, with my co-host, Elena, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the most common myths about homeschooling. So grab your favorite drink and come join us on the couch. All right, well, welcome back to another episode of our podcast. I'm excited today. We're going to talk about the myths of homeschooling, or at least some of the myths that we've heard a lot of over the years. We thought we would share them with you. We've got 5 of our top most common myths, and hopefully we can answer some of the, rebuttal some of these myths so you can see that they're not really accurate at all. But the first one that we know is that everyone thinks that it's basically just doing school at home. Like, just take your classroom and move it home. And I'd have to say I don't agree with that one. What about you?
Yeah, I've had lots of people think like you just stand up in front of everybody and teach them at a blackboard. It's kind of a funny picture, trying to do that in your dining room. I suppose some people might homeschool that way, but the vast majority do not.
Yeah, so the cool thing about homeschooling is that it is so personalized. For every 100 families, you'll find 100 different ways to homeschool. Homeschooling has so many different options and ways to teach that it doesn't have to be what you think of when you think of a classroom setting. We don't need desks and we don't need whiteboards or, blackboards or teachers and textbooks and workbooks. There's so many different ways to teach our kids.
I've noticed that a lot of people think that it's also just like very workbook based, and it can be. It totally can be, but it doesn't have to be. It's up to the individual family and how their child learns best and what works best for them.
So there's lots of different methods, but there's things like the traditional schooling method, where it really is just using a textbook and a workbook, and the parent teaches or the child reads the textbook and then does worksheets based on that. That is one option that's available. And honestly, that's probably where most people start, because that's what they're used to, or they expect it to be. And then they realize as they move along that it doesn't always have to be that way. Or if it works best for their family, so be it. There's also approaches such as Charlotte Mason, which is based on a early 1900s British educator who believed that school should be based on the whole child and like everything. So teaching habits, teaching nature study, teaching language through things like narration and dictation and copywriting. She was really heavy into art and using living books and reading. And Charlotte Mason is one method that some homeschoolers choose to use. It's pretty popular, I'd say, in the homeschool community. There's also classical homeschooling, which focuses on something called the trivium, where they essentially break down child development into 3 main stages. Basically, in the first few years of school, children are like little sponges. So you use that opportunity to memorize facts, figures, information. They learn all the information and absorb it. And then as they get older, they understand why they were taught those things. And then when they're in the oldest stage, they learn how to be able to explain those things. So I'm not an expert in classical education, unfortunately. The classical education tends to be more heavy, and not necessarily in a bad way, but more focused on academics. So you'll see in classical homeschooling resources that's Latin or Greek. Then there's also things like Montessori, which usually we think of in the early years as opposed to all the way through, but it can be all the way through. It's very child-centered, very child-focused. So the child chooses the activities sort of in some ways, and they tend to use real objects that are child-sized so the child can get hands-on experience. So for example, in the early years, if a child needs to learn how to pour a cup of orange juice, they're given a cup, a child-sized cup and a child-sized pitcher with water or orange juice in it, and they're given the opportunity to learn that. They tend to use really wooden materials and have options available on shelves. Like, it's very tactile and hands-on. The Waldorf experience as well is also another way, which uses very art and is very nature-based and focuses on the hand, the heart, and the head of a child. Awesome. Yeah, unit studies is another one. So basically,
unit studies.
Yeah, you take a topic and then you learn all the pieces around it. If you're studying something like weather, and that's the one I tend to use a lot, you can use other resources related to weather to help with all the subjects. So weather is your primary topic. And then for math, for example, you might learn about temperature and how to convert between Celsius and Fahrenheit. And you might keep records of the weather temperatures for the day. And if you're doing language, you might do stories about the weather. You might write weather reports every day. For science, you would understand why different things happen in weather, such as learning why there's thunderstorms, or learning about tornadoes, or learning about anything related to weather. That's science. In social studies, things like past things that were very impacted by the weather, such as maybe a tornado that was in the town, or another big natural disaster that's related to weather. And then if you're studying another language, you might have that word, various word choices from that other language specific to weather as well. So there's lots of ways to tie in other subjects to that one specific unit. Unschooling is when you let your child lead how the learning is going to be. It can be done through life experiences. It can be done by natural curiosity. So it's not that you're excluding out all curriculum altogether, but it is following your child's lead towards what they want to learn. So if your child is super passionate about sharks this week, things lean about sharks and you learn about sharks. If your child really decides, I'm going to be going to post-secondary school and I really want to make sure my math foundations are great, all of a sudden you're going to choose to use a program that helps your child develop those math foundations. So unschooling is one option as well. The one that people tend to end up at the end is called eclectic, where you pull little bits and pieces from all different kinds of resources. We call it the mishmash quilt of learning, and then you pick the stuff that will work for your family and get rid of the ones that don't. Yeah, so that's why homeschooling doesn't have to be the same as school at home.
No, and I would say that I didn't really pick like a certain style at the beginning. I didn't even know that was a thing. I kind of like happened on that later. So I kind of just naturally was eclectic from the beginning. I would say, though, that overall, like math has always been pretty traditional for us. I mean, I've added on some hands-on elements or, math manipulatives, but I would say it's always been fairly traditional. As far as everything else goes, we used a lot of really good literature and books. Definitely kind of a mix of some literature-based, some unit studies, some traditional, some Charlotte Mason. But like unit studies for us, like we would get into that with like history or science, but I never would like make it go across all the subjects because I don't know, to me that kind of just got a little bit boring, if that makes sense. We'll do like a study in something for like, say I'll do some read alouds on it and we'll be studying that unit in science, but I won't like try to bring it into math and try to bring it into language arts. Like we'll just have a separate program for that we follow along. That's probably, I guess, more traditional, especially for math. Language arts may be a little bit more traditional / Charlotte Mason, if that's even a thing. Eclectic, I guess.
Yeah, and same with us. So we tend to do a lot of more traditional math. Math seems to be a hard one to let go of in terms of the traditional perspective because it's so not heavy. Not the word I'm looking for, but it's more formal than some of the other things. There's sort of a system that needs to be followed. So it's easier to use a more traditional kind of approach with math, but not everybody does that, but that's how we've used it as well. I do think that unit studies work really well in science and history and geography, those things that it tends to lean heavily into that. And I admit, I love unit studies. I love being able to create things that are all based around a topic and how to pull in a field trip and an activity and a hands-on project and books that we have, or go to the library and take the whole section of the books all about magnetism and then, whatever. I like doing those kinds of things. They don't always work for my family, but that's where I started homeschooling myself. I was very much, we're going to learn about space and everything was about space. We did crafts, we did snacks, we did videos, we did all the things related to space. And it wasn't until later that I realized that wasn't going to work great for my kids. We moved to different options of programs over time, and we change all the time. In my house, we tend to use something I call the minimalist relaxed approach, which is where I have specific requirements for specific subjects, and then we do a lot of free learning outside of that.
Yeah, I would say that we've definitely over the years, I don't know, people that like unschool like all the time would probably laugh at this, but like we've done some unschooling as well at certain times. I don't know, say a child just really has an interest in something, then I will just deep dive into that plus do our math in LA. I almost think of it more as a delight directed thing. Like if my child's really interested in something, then I will go with that for a while. And I'm not going to worry about like, following the program and everything else. If they have a question about something, then we've always just gone for it. If they have a sudden question that rabbit trails us off somewhere, then we'll get the other stuff done a different day.
Yeah, because the cool thing about homeschooling is it's not that school happens from 9 to 3. It's like woven into all the life. So,
Yeah.
like, we can learn experiences at 5 p.m. if we suddenly are watching a show that talks about something, and all of a sudden we're having conversations about women's rights in early 1900s in Canada, and then we end up on a complete rabbit trail at 6 p.m. It's not just school at home, it's school in life.
Yeah, it's true. And that's why it's so hard, this like, I don't know, school at home idea. They just think that like it ends at a specific time. It really doesn't. I remember even like the other day, just like out with one of my children, and they started asking me specific questions about something, and I just started answering. We had a big conversation. Like that wasn't planned. It wasn't like, oh, the workbook says we need to cover this now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So I think people's idea though is that that's what it is you just follow along this specific thing. There's so much life learning that happens.
homeschooling is a lifestyle. So then talking about that a little bit is more, we're talking about curriculum, but one of the other things I've been asked, I remember dropping my daughter off at a club the other day, and one of the leaders was waiting. So she got curious and chatted with me, and she's like, so does the government give you your curriculum? And I was like, no.
And they're so confused. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that's the second myth, is that the government provides you with the materials that you need so that you can follow along with the school system.
Yeah. I had the same thing at Walmart the other day. I was there with one of my kids and it was during the school day. So of course the inevitable question, like, why aren't you in school? Like, do you have an appointment? And I just always think like, why is it any of your business? But whatever.
Yeah.
I just cheerfully, I'm like, oh, we homeschool. And she says, you what? I'm like, we homeschool. And she's like, pardon? I guess this person hadn't been exposed to it. So I was like, oh, it means I teach my child at home myself. And she's like, oh, so the government gives you curriculum and you follow that? I'm like, no. And she's like, so are you a teacher? And I'm like, no. And I'm thinking, oh, I'm trying to bag up my groceries, look after my child, trying to answer. I don't think she really understood in the end, but she just kept asking, like, she must ask 3 times. Well, doesn't the government give you curriculum? Really? They don't? Oh, surely they do. Like, it was just this ongoing thing. Like, she couldn't believe it.
I think it's because also people have, and again, we fall back on this preconceived idea of what school is like. So
Yeah.
there's a specific way that it needs to be taught, but there should also be a specific subject pattern that you should follow. In Canada, every province has their own, and the government does provide a curriculum, a set of learning outcomes for each grade, for every subject. So there are things like, okay, in grade whatever, you have to learn punctuation and capitalization. Like, they have expectations for what a child at that grade would learn if they were in a school classroom. And as a
Yeah.
homeschooler, we can choose to follow that if we want to. There's only a few provinces that I can think of that require homeschoolers to follow the plan along with the school board. Most provinces do not. If you choose to, you can. In the provinces that aren't as regulated with a checklist of things that they have to complete, you have to decide what you want to do. Sometimes that's a lot of pressure, and so it's easier just to copy what the government is outlining for the kids in school. And for other people, they like that freedom because it means they can do the natural thing like we've been talking about.
Yeah, I think too, like the whole idea about the government giving curriculum, people thinking that's the idea. Like, if that does interest you, having something laid out, then I think that's when you'd go to a more traditional approach where you use a curriculum not provided by the government, but by a homeschool curriculum. I mean, you can follow the government outcomes, but it's not going to be like laid out in workbooks for you. So if you wanted that kind of style, then you could follow a homeschool curriculum that kind of followed along a plan of what you're going to go through. And we've used some of those things over the years, like I said, especially for math. But there's been times when I've been like using a program and been like, nah, let's skip that part. And I think that's nice too about like the freedom in homeschooling is that if you are using a set curriculum, then you can skip something, of course, unless you live in one of those places where they specifically tell you you have to meet this requirement. But I'm speaking as somebody who doesn't have that, then yeah, there's been times where we've skipped over something because it's just not what's going to work for us at that time, or I'll cover that later, or we've already covered that.
And I was laughing because I was talking to someone about high school math this week. In the high school math that's mostly available to homeschoolers is based on American math system. So it's like
Yeah.
algebra 1, geometry, algebra 2, pre-calculus, calculus. Most of the Canadian classes, especially in the early years, are like a combination of subjects as opposed to a specific
Yeah.
year on a specific topic. So
Yeah, it's mixed in, it's all together.
yeah, so it can be trickier when you're doing high school, for example, because you have to kind of use what's available as opposed to what the government would set out for the curriculum at that age level. If you want to kind of follow along with what the government has set out for an expectation for each grade, you can go to our website. We are currently updating them, but there are curriculum checklists on there where we have taken what different provinces, and we don't have them all, but we have most of the major ones at this point. We're still working away. It's a continued work in progress.
Well,
But
they keep changing it. We get it
yes,
done and they're like, updating this. It's like, no.
I just finished that. But you can take those curriculum checklists, which give you the outline of what is expected by the government for a classroom setting, and then develop a plan from there. So, for example, in science, this is kind of like the unit study topic. So, if in science in grade 4, you're learning about geology, rocks and minerals, well, then you can do a rocks and minerals program with your kid. You can use it as a general guideline for what to teach and what to do at those ages. You just find resources that match along with it. There's so many amazing curriculum options out there and so many amazing resources out there that you can tie in somehow. Places like Teachers Pay Teachers. There are different
there's a lot on
places
there that matches the curriculum. It'll say literally like, aligns with the, grade 7 Ontario curriculum or aligns with the grade 3 Alberta curriculum or whatever for whatever subject. You can find stuff on there.
So it's up to you what you want to do, but the government, sadly, in most places, I mean, I know there are some provinces where you can purchase, or like for $50, you can buy the textbooks for the year, but it's not, most places aren't like that. So the next myth is the big question that everyone always asks.
What about socialization?
What about socialization?
Or I've even had it said, wow, but your kids seem so normal and socialized. I'm just like, thanks, because obviously they were expecting otherwise.
The word socialization means learning how to behave in society. But I think people are usually asking, but how do your kids make friends?
Yeah.
I think that's really what they mean when they say that. Because we can learn how to behave in society just by existing in society. We have families, we have community groups, we have social activities that we participate in. Kids don't need to go to school to learn how to stand in a line and put up their hand and be quiet when a grown-up is talking, or not interrupt, or to wait their turn, or any of those things, because life has those opportunities built into it already. Or they can participate in activities where the, quote, well-trained kids model that for our kids who'd learn that very quickly.
I think too that socialization needs to be a wide range. Like it can't just be always with the same age people. I think that it's important. Like adult life isn't like that. It's not like, oh, I'm this age and you're that age, so sorry, like we can't be friends. I've always really appreciated that about homeschooling, that my kids have always played with like a wide range of ages, not just like, oh, this person's in my grade, so that's going to be my friend. I think homeschooling lends itself very well to that socialization across the age groups, better than spending a vast majority of your time at the school where it's the same age peers a lot of the time.
I had my kids out at the park with a homeschool group, and we were playing baseball. Well, we were playing soccer baseball in the snow, which doesn't really work all that well. But we were, but the group of kids that were participating were everything from 5 to like 17. And nobody was like, you can't play, you're too little, or you're too big, or anything. Everyone was cheering each other on and explaining how to play and just encouraging each other. It was really cool to see such a wide group of kids getting along together. The other really cool thing is that a lot of homeschool kids get the opportunities to interact with adults who aren't just authority figures. So they get to learn how to have conversations and be able to have grown-up talks with people in a way that's respectful, and instead of kind of forced leadership. Does that make sense?
I get what you mean. It's just like it's a different type of interacting with adults than they would get in a school environment the majority of the time.
Correct. So
Yeah. And I think too, like people say, oh, how are you going to socialize them? Well, there's so many opportunities. Like I'm thinking in our family over the years. So
mm,
we have been involved with neighborhood kids, neighborhood just neighbors. Like we have a good relationship with our next door neighbors that are in their 80s. I've always made a point of like trying to get to know neighbors when we move somewhere and trying to build a relationship. Sometimes it doesn't work well, but sometimes it's worked really well. You meet people at the park and the kids get along well. Like, hey, like, what street do you live on? Do you mind if I drop by with the kids sometime and we can meet up at the park again? Like, those kind of things that you do. Meeting people at the library. We've done summer reading programs over the years. My kids have been part of youth groups. We have our church community. That's not for everyone, but that's been a big part of our socialization. With homeschooling, in our case, there's never been tons of money for like expensive paid extracurriculars, but there's always been things that have been low cost or free even that have come up. If you watch kind of your community pages and stuff, there's always things happening. Ask around other moms. There's been stuff run by the museum that's been like really low cost that we've done over the years. The library, different programs. There's different stuff that happens that you can use to socialize with your kids. I know too, like another big thing is definitely homeschool groups. And I know like we have quite a bit on that on the website. We have like about starting a homeschool group. If you don't have one in your community, we have a whole page all about what's it called? Canadian homeschool support groups on Facebook. Facebook is usually where those kind of things are. Like it or not, that's a big part of it. Joining up with those local groups. Like I know some homeschoolers that aren't part of those, and I'm just like, how do you do that? I usually try to ask 2 other families that my kids really get along with well. So I know some of their friends are going to be there. 2, because inevitably one of them will say last minute, oh no, someone's sick or I can't go. So then we at least have usually 1 other family, sometimes 2 that can go. And then I invite everyone else. Hey, this family and I are going to the park at this date or the hike at this date or the pool or whatever it is. Do you want to come join us? Anyone welcome. And then people come. It's simple. I don't have to do a lot of planning and organizing. Doesn't cost a lot. And then trying to meet up with those families often so you can build those relationships instead of just seeing different people all the time, I think is really important to socialization when you're homeschooling.
Agreed. So yeah, we've done lots of things over the years as well. One of the things that we found great was a Y membership because we didn't have money either. If you live in a place that has a Y membership, they often have family passes so that you can participate in a lot of activities. And then at the Y that we went to for a long time, there was a swimming pool and they had a homeschool group class that they ran one afternoon a week. But they also had other things like karate class and dance class and things. So if you can't afford any of the high-end ones, well, you can join the community group one. So a Y is another possibility. The local art museum used to run art classes. So we would go there once a week for a while when the boys were young. Then there's things like the Home Depot and there's lots of places that you can go and do free things. So they just get to be around other people. But I do agree with finding a group of homeschoolers that you can do it with because they understand the same struggles and they understand the same, commonalities between it. And the kids click a little bit better because they're different like me. So it can be helpful to have that as well. Yes, I think that school does offer the opportunity for kids to develop friendships easier because they're with them together all the time. But homeschooling, we have to be more intentional about our time together with other
Yeah.
families and with other things. So it can be hard. It can be hard, especially I feel as a mom who had a lot of boys, I found around grade 6, the boys started disappearing from homeschool groups because parents decided they should go back to school. So that happened to us a lot. The older that they got, the less and less boys were in the group. Not that it mattered. My boys were happy to play with girls, but at some point when all the girls are doing their little hee thing in the background, the boys are rolling their eyes a little bit, right? But it can be a lot of fun to be part of a group who are interested in wanting to participate. And my daughter, who is my super social butterfly child, absolutely loves anytime we can get together with any of the kids because that just makes her happy and fills her up completely. And when people come to our house, they are like, my kids are squealing with joy because they love to have friends around. But friends can be anywhere, not just in school. Like my daughter's best friend was a kid down the street for a long time.
Yeah, I think you definitely have a point there. Like, I don't think it was just because when your boys got older that it's because they're boys, but I also found that a lot of people stop homeschooling at that point. And So there's not as many, and that kind of contributes to the feelings of it's harder for them to socialize at that point because
Hmm.
there's not as many people homeschooling the high school teen years. And I find kids at that age also get more specific who they want to be friends with. And
Hmm.
um, like when it's younger, I don't know, you just put together a bunch of like young kids and they just all play. They're not specific at that point. I don't really know when it changes, but it seems to get worse during the teen years.
No, I agree with you. I have how many random people's phone numbers do I have in my phone from my daughter meeting someone at the park, and she had to have their contact information in case we ever could meet up again.
Yeah,
So the young kids don't seem to have a problem with making friends.
yeah. So it definitely gets harder when they get older, but I mean, then you have to be more intentional about making sure
Yes.
there's time for the things that do interest them and do matter to them. It can be harder with some kids. Like some kids can struggle with mental health or struggle with whatever it is. It makes that even harder for them. But I think that aside, that when you're homeschooling, it has to be more intentional. And that can be hard because it's kind of like built in with the school system. They're already there. There's already activities that your kids can join that are school-based, that kind of thing. So
Yeah. I remember that there's a saying that I always liked that is, why do they call it homeschooling when we're never at home anyways?
yeah.
Because a lot of people get really active in their communities and so they're never around anyways. I just, so my, on another point of view for that is just be careful not to overschedule yourself because you'll burn out, your kids will burn out and you'll be tired and won't want to do
Yeah.
anything anymore.
I think like where we are, like there's never been that many opportunities that's really been an issue. But I think I've seen groups in other larger places that I'm like, whoa, like you literally could have something every day. And
Every day.
that would
Yeah.
definitely be too much.
The other thing about it is that because homeschooling is different, people find different hard. So they can't necessarily they won't necessarily understand something is available. Why would you choose something different? Like I see that too. So it's hard to see, well, what about socialization? Because our world is expecting socialization to be held or managed in a specific way. So it's the same thing with lots of aspects related to homeschooling. It's different. So it's strange, right?
Sometimes with these questions that people ask, like I don't think I need to answer everybody's questions about it all the time, like to great
Mm-hmm.
detail, because some people don't want to know all of that. And some people, it's like they're not really truly interested. They're more like,
Making
kind of,
conversation.
yeah, or kind of like against it. So I don't know.
Mm.
I always, when people ask about socialization, I always say, like, oh, we're involved with a few things in the community for extracurriculars. We're involved with the neighborhood friends. We're involved with our church, and we're involved with a local homeschool group. There's actually quite a lot of homeschool families in this area, even though you might not know about them. There's quite a lot, and we're involved with that as well. And that kind of satisfies them. They're like, oh, I didn't realize that.
So the other thing that people have said a lot is that they believe that homeschoolers are a bunch of, quote, religious nutcases, unquote, or maybe they're extremists or conspiracy theorists, or they just don't want anything to do with society anyways.
Right.
Mm.
So
Uh,
I've definitely encountered that. Like I've had people hear that I homeschool and then immediately just assume certain things about me. And I'm like, no.
hmm.
And that's kind of odd in my mind, but I think it's becoming more within the norm of what people have heard about at least.
Yeah.
Different things have happened. Like I've seen, for example, other homeschooling families get their picture in the paper for things and it mentions about homeschooling, or people heard a lot more about homeschooling during COVID. Things like that where it's becoming a little bit more, at least people have heard of it, or they'll say like, oh, my, sister-in-law's cousin's friend homeschools, or something like
Yeah, yeah.
that. It's becoming a little less than that, but there definitely still is. Like I've definitely still had comments directed to me, like just assuming certain things about me because I homeschool, or assuming that I'm completely against the school system. And I'm sure there's homeschoolers out there like that, but that's not us. And so it's interesting to me that there's so many views on that people seem to have even now.
Yeah. Well, I think historically, if we look back at homeschooling, it kind of did start in the Christian community. It's more of the conservative style of Christianity did pull a lot of their kids out because they didn't necessarily agree with that the school board was teaching their kids. And so if we look back, yes, maybe that's where the homeschooling movement began and what grew out of. But now in 2024, I'd say that the homeschooling community is a huge eclectic group of people. So yes, we do have large Christian communities, but we also have a growing and continued growing group of secular homeschoolers who want nothing to do with faith-based learning. And I've seen an extreme uptick in that since COVID, for example. People realized that,
Yeah.
I can learn it. I can teach my kids at home. And there's some more resources that have become available and things that are falling in place to help support that as well. I also see that a lot of people choose to homeschool for no religious reasons at all. So they've chosen to homeschool because their kids are being bullied, or their kids have special needs and aren't getting met in the school system, or they've just, their lifestyle is very nomadic, or they travel a lot, or those kinds of things. Like, there's lots of other reasons that people homeschool than faith. And also, I've seen a large uptick in the Muslim community with homeschooling as well. Different faith bases are homeschooling as well now too. So it's not just that people are choosing to homeschool because they're Christian or a nut job, or they're a conspiracy theorist, or that they are an extremist, as in they don't want anything to do with the brainwashing of their children. I mean, there's going to be those kinds of people everywhere anyways. And if that's you, that's totally fine. That's not how the majority of the group is. So just understand that people homeschool for a lot of reasons, and it's not always just faith-based or anti-school based.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that since I started homeschooling, where the vast majority of people I met near the beginning, or all of the people that I knew back when, say, I was a teenager, were all for faith-based reasons. And now I see, I would say more than half definitely aren't just homeschooling for faith-based reasons. Like, that's not where they're coming from. So, yeah, you can definitely find homeschool groups that are like faith-based only in one way or another. But there's a lot of like mixed groups, or groups where they just have it laid out that that's not something we're going to discuss, or that kind of things. There's definitely a lot of people out there that's myth is definitely incorrect. There are so many people, and even more in the last decade that I can think of, that are definitely not homeschooling for faith-based reasons, or those kind of extreme views on certain things.
I 100% agree. And I think that impacts our last myth that we're going to talk about today, which is about homeschoolers can't go to post-secondary school.
Yeah, that's a big one too.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of changes with this over the last, even since I've been homeschooling in the last 15 years or so, that homeschooling is more like an acceptable option of education, as opposed to maybe in the 1980s when it was totally a foreign concept. But now it seems to be more commonplace, as we've seen through COVID and stuff. And so the idea that a homeschooler can't go to post-secondary is absolutely inaccurate.
And I know lots of people that have done it, so obviously it's not accurate.
Not at all. So I think the reason people ask that is, again, we're talking about the different things. So a typical progression towards post-secondary is you go to high school, you get a diploma, you apply for university, and then you get in based on marks or acceptance requirements. And when you don't follow that traditional path, it can seem like, well, how do you do it then? Like, how can you get there?
Right. And the hard part is that there is no one answer. So that gets kind of complicated, because it's not like, all across Canada, universities or colleges or whatever it is, trades, have this formula that you follow these steps 1 through 5 and get in. It's individual to the school or to the trade or to the whatever it is that you're doing. And that's when it gets complicated. You can't have like exact steps. It's like, basically you have to start doing your research while your child's in high school, and even contact the school. Some of them do have like a homeschool admission policy on their website. I've seen that. But many don't. You have to contact them and ask them, and there's different things. So it's almost like that's what I think makes it complicated, is there's different ways. And there's not only one way either. So if that school says, like, I do know of one university in Ontario that does not accept homeschoolers based on just that you homeschooled with something unaccredited all the way through. So therefore you want to go there, like, you'd need to do something that's accredited for high school, or you would need to, I'm not sure exactly, but maybe you'd have to write the testing. I mean, it used to be called the GED, but they're transitioning to something else now, but there's so many ways to do post-secondary. Like, I've heard of people doing courses through the online, what's it called? I can't even say that word.
Athabasca University.
university, and it's only an online university. Like there's no brick and mortar building. And so you do some courses through there, and then it's like, oh, you can do this, and you get in. I've even heard of somebody, they wanted to go to a really prestigious program at a specific university, doesn't accept homeschoolers. So instead, they got into a different university and went there for a year, and then they transferred. So then they didn't even look at her high school marks, which, I mean, she didn't have anything official. They looked at, okay, you did fine in your 1 year of university, and we'll accept you now. So there's so many different ways to do it. And I think that's what makes it kind of scary and kind of like, oh no, we can't do this. But there are ways. I think it's also good to recognize that things are changing all the time. The ways to get in are going to change. I think it probably will just get easier. I don't know for sure, but that's my thought, because there's going to be more and more people that are trying to do that.
Yeah. And I agree with you. There is no one way. So it's like people who are like me trying to help homeschoolers. It's really hard when the people are like, well, how do we go to post-secondary? It's like, well, see, so it really depends on the school. And as Elena said,
and the program.
Yeah. So as Elena said, check first of all to see if the schools that you want to go to have a homeschooler policy of how they accept homeschoolers, and then create a transcript of the work that you've done with the grades that you've done, and keep a track of what resources you used for every subject. So for example, if you're doing math and you've used Math UC for all of your way through high school, write down the programs. You can even keep a copy of the table of contents so you sees what so they can see what subjects were covered in that particular year of subject, and then any grades that you have. Any group, if you're an unschooler, you can keep track of different topics that you've covered. I saw somebody talking about how their child was curious about Shakespeare, so they went and saw a bunch of plays, and then they also at home were just talking a lot about Shakespeare, or the student decided they were going to write their own soliloquies and things like that. So just keeping context of all the stuff that they've learned throughout the year, keeping all that helps. I remember a couple of years ago when I did the Canadian Online Homeschool Conference that I had a chance to talk with an admissions officer from Brock University, which is just one university and not how everybody else necessarily accepts homeschool students. But in their particular situation, what they did is they asked homeschoolers to provide them with their transcript, their descriptions, and like a, not necessarily a portfolio, but more like a information packets of what they learned from each subject. And then the admissions office would go through whether it would meet the credentials that they had for their particular course that they were trying to apply for. So then they could accept them based on that instead of a grade from school. So that was one, I think.
Right. And some people too decide to do the official accredited route. Like in Ontario, they have the virtual high school, or they have what's it called, virtual learning center, or the
ILC.
I think so. There's also Christian virtual school. I'm sure there's others. Other provinces might have some, especially some of the more populated provinces, where you can do the government curriculum at home and get your official diploma from your official whatever it's called for your province or territory, and do it that way. I'm not sure if that's available in all provinces or territories. Something to look into if that interests you. And then it literally would be the same process as a brick and mortar school. Yeah, that's another option out there, something to consider.
Yeah, and in some provinces, you can actually test out. So you can take a challenge test. So you can like take an exam, and if you pass, then you pass the course. Like you get the credit for that course. So I know I'm pretty sure there are some provinces that have that. The other thing is I have a friend whose son wanted to apply to college, like community college. The community colleges here in Ontario have programs that allow you to do upgrade courses so that you can get like a fundamentals in math and language and whatever, like the basics that they require. And when they can see that you can complete, and they're free, most of them, I think it's free through the college. And then when you've completed those courses, the school will accept you based on that.
Yeah. Isn't it called ACE or something like that?
I think so. I couldn't.
ACE. It's not ACE like the homeschool curriculum. It's literally a different, same acronym, different
meaning. Yeah.
Yeah, so, totally different meaning. Yeah, I have heard of somebody even, I don't know if they still allow this, but something to think about is that they did homeschooling at home, the unaccredited route. And then at the end, they did some accredited grade 12s. Like you need the official way to get your OSSD is to get all the credits all the way through, but then to get at least 6 of the university credits for for grade 12. That's in Ontario. So then their child somehow did through like a virtual online accredited thing, did those just the grade 12 credits, but something to look into. You can even, I think you can even wait until you're over 19 and apply as
Yeah.
a mature student. And then they don't even look at your high school marks. Somebody was telling me, don't quote me on it, but that was something that I had heard about.
Yeah, I was going to say mature students as well. So there's lots
Yeah,
of ways
okay.
to go to there's lots of ways to go to post-secondary if you're a homeschooler. It's just not the go to high school, get your credits, get your diploma, apply for university. It's a little bit more complicated and there's more steps and you may have to do some hoop jumping.
Yeah,
And,
and individually ask the individual schools you're interested in. And probably
correct.
like earlier, like I wouldn't wait till like the end of grade 12. I
No.
would wait till grade 10, 11, even just out of curiosity to know, to keep some options open. Like say your child hasn't committed to, yes, I want to do that, but just so they know. So you can be like, okay, you might be interested in this. So let's make sure we're meeting those requirements.
I know that on our website, I had a guest post from Louise House, who used to run the Learning House. And one of the things she said is be proactive for high school. So you start at the end and work backwards. So if your child knows what they kind of want to go into, you can get a general feel for what comes next at university. So research what they expect or what they need, and then develop out your learning plan for high school based around that plan. Now, things can change as you go, but if you know that in order to be admitted into engineering, you need XYZ, well, then through high school, you're going to make sure that you're checking all those boxes off. And then if your child changes their mind halfway through, it's not like they ruined their education because they focused on something science-based throughout high school. So just kind of work backwards, being proactive towards what the final goal is. The other thing I would say is not everything needs to have post-secondary. Just because that might be a traditional way of what comes after high school doesn't mean that is the end result for everybody. And especially, I'd say, in today's society where you can learn just about anything online. So, I mean, I'm not expecting doctors to watch YouTube videos and be able to do surgery. But I mean, there are lots of jobs and careers and things that people can do without having to have that post-secondary piece. So it doesn't need to be the end goal if that's not going to be the end goal that your child has. So don't panic if that's not the path that ends up being taken by your kids.
Yeah, and another thing to consider is that post-secondary, so whatever you want to call it, life after high school, there's a bunch of different routes. So university or college are only two of the routes. I actually have a post on the website called After High School Choices for Canadian Homeschoolers. And there's a whole bunch of things fleshed out there about, getting into the trades or taking a gap year or joining the workforce. It really would depend on the student and it would depend on where they're at. And maybe things change. Say they're not ready for university, but they would maybe still like to go someday. Then maybe they do one of those other things first. Maybe they take a year off and figure it out. Like there's many different routes that you can take. I know there's been a lot of information lately that we've been having there as well, different blog posts about the trades. And you don't always need to do post-secondary education to do a trade. There's many different routes to that as well.
I guess the idea is that homeschoolers can do just about everything a traditional public schooler can do. It just might not be the exact same path to get there.
Right, exactly. And it's not a like laid out exact path, always the same for every single thing. Yeah, it depends on what your child wants to do and which individual school they want to go to.
Just like everything else in homeschooling, the answer is that varies and is personalized.
Yeah, pretty much.
So are there any other myths you can think of that are really common in the homeschool community, or you think we've got most of them?
Yeah.
I'm sure there's lots more, such as, everyone wears matching denim jumpers. Maybe that's not so common anymore.
I think
now
that
it's
was
not
more like the
1990.
80s and 90s, yeah.
But
or
in
the
general,
whole like you have to have a big family to homeschool, like
yes.
one of those big 15 passenger vans, and that's totally great if you're into that, but not everybody does that.
Yeah.
But,
And
like,
I have 5 kids, so I considered a big family, I guess.
I know it's weird. I have
15.
4 and people will go on about it and I'm like, 4? Like I know families with 10, with 14, like 4 is not very big.
The thing that I want to reiterate about homeschooling is the words that you hear from the general public aren't always the truth about homeschooling. Make sure you connect with an actual homeschooler if you have questions about homeschooling. And remember, they may not always have the space right at that time to explain it to you. But if you're willing to learn and willing to take the time, that usually people are willing to talk with you about the homeschooling choices that they've made for their family. And give you some insight into the truth about homeschooling as opposed to just the myths that are floating around out there in society.
Yeah. And also keep in mind that, like, if you meet one homeschooler, that's not necessarily how every homeschooler is. So you need to take that into account. And if you meet somebody that homeschools, you're like, oh, that's not the way I really want to do it. Well, that's fine. Each is so individual.
Absolutely true. All right. Well, thanks for joining me, Elena.
Yeah.
And we'll see you all next time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the chance to debunk some homeschool myths with us. On our next episode, we're going to talk about learning ideas for spring, so we hope you'll join us then. If you have any feedback, ideas for topics, or people that we should connect with to have interviews, please let us know. And don't forget to share with your Canadian homeschooling friends. Thanks so much for joining in. Until next time, happy learning.